Okay, buenos días, buenas tardes, good morning to our Latin American friends and good evening to our friends in Europe. My name is Mark Angel. I'm an MEP from Luxembourg, and I belong to the group of the Socialists and the Democrats, and I'm very honored that I can replace today my Greek colleague Nikos Androulakis, who unfortunately cannot be with us today, but he sends the greetings to all his friends here in Europe and also in Latin America. If you allow, dear friends, dear colleagues, I would like to pay tribute to the victims of this terrible accident which happened in Mexico City, where a metro overpass collapsed and where at least 23 people lost their lives and many, many people are injured. I think our thoughts today are with the victims, with their loved ones, with their families, and also with the emergency teams, the rescuers, the medical teams, which are taking care of the injured persons. And we hope that the number of deaths will not rise and that injured people will get well very soon. So I ask you to pay tribute, and I propose a minute of silence to think of the victims of this terrible accident. Thank you very much. I would like to welcome all the members for their presence at this meeting. And this is the first regular meeting of this committee in the year 2021. I would also like to welcome the members of the European and also of the Latin American diplomatic services who are present with us today, and all other personalities. And of course, I will not forget to welcome the representatives of the European Economic and Social Committee, who, as we all know, are attending our members as observers according to our rules of procedures. I would like to inform participants that at this time the organization of the meeting was carried out by the European Parliament, and I would like already in advance thank our Secretariat and everybody who is involved in this organization for the excellent preparatory work and also the excellent work they're doing all during this week. Today we have active interpretation in several languages. Let me list them. We have English, Spanish, of course, French and Portuguese, and additionally we have passive interpretation in German and Italian. And please, I have to inform you also that our interpreters, they rely on high quality sound and also on video of all our remote participants in order that you can get your message across. So please be aware that phone interventions and audio-only connections will not be interpreted. So if you want to be interpreted, you must switch on your camera on your computer or your device. And also, I want to inform you that this meeting is going to be web streamed, like always, and also recorded. So far, dear colleagues, this was some technical details, and I think we can start now with today's agenda. We have the first point on the agenda is, of course, the adoption of the draft agenda. You have been this agenda has been sent to everybody. It was distributed. So are there any questions? No? So there's no objection, so this agenda will be adopted. And now we can come then to the second agenda point, which is the approval of the minutes of the meeting of the 17th September 2018 in Vienna in Austria. You have also been sent a document. This meeting took place, as I said, in Vienna on the 17th of September 2018. So Do you have any questions relating to this document and to these minutes of this meeting? No? If no modifications are received by the end of the meeting, the minutes of the said meeting will be approved as they stand. So thank you very much for that. Then we come to the third agenda point, which is some announcements of the co-chair. So dear colleagues, as I said already, this is the first ordinary meeting with civil society in 2021 and the first after the meeting held in Vienna on the 17th of September 2018. The Latin American component of EuroLat has appointed Mr. José Serrano, who is the EuroLat co-vice president, as the new vice president responsible for relations with civil society. I would like, in the name of all of us, congratulate Mr. Serrano to his appointment, and we are all looking forward to a very fruitful cooperation with Mr. Serrano. So, Vice President Serrano, I would love to give you the floor and welcome you also to this meeting. José, the floor is yours.
Muchísimas gracias, señor co-presidente.
Thank you very much, co-chair. It's an honor for me to be able to work with you in this committee, and I hope that this will become a permanent link with civil society so that we can discuss the issues that are relevant to them and relevant to the EU and Latin America and the Caribbean. We're facing an event that is extraordinary, but an event which has also shown us the fragility of human beings and also the fragile nature of our global institutions, the fragile nature of our states. That was just as an introduction, but what I would say, I think, is that we need to call for the appropriate integration processes to be speeded up so that multilateralism becomes the central focus of actions taken in the future when there are new disasters, new pandemics, or new risks that humanity will face. And I think that this space can be very fruitful in that context. I'm going to give you back the floor, co-chair, so that we can continue with the agenda that has been adopted.
Thank you very much, co-chair. Indeed, civil society is so very important. We as politicians, we have to consider civil society as an ally, and this is what this committee is about. And also, dear co-chair, I fully agree with you that integration has indeed to be speed up, and because the more integrated we are, the stronger we are together. So thank you once again for your kind words. The time available for this meeting is very limited, dear colleagues, and we have to work efficiently to complete the planned agenda, and it's not always easy, with all the technical challenges we have. And so to allow a very smooth and also an effective debate, the following distribution of the floor and of speaking time is proposed. Our guest speakers will have a maximum of 8 minutes each for the initial presentation, and then they will have 3 minutes for the reply to the questions. Other speakers, they have a maximum of 2 minutes per participant. The distribution is dedicated by the need for interpretation, which will only be provided up to the time the meeting is scheduled to end. As all the items on the agenda must be dealt with, I ask the speakers to strictly adhere to the proposed distribution of speaking time. And lastly, due to the limitation that the semi-remote holding of this meeting entails, the floor will be given to members who have requested it prior to this meeting and appear on the list available to the co-chairs. If during the meeting it is found that there is time available, The co-chair may give the floor to other members who are not on the list and who request to speak. And I can tell you the speaking list so far is not that long, so I invite colleagues who have not asked for speaking time that they can raise the speak button or give us a sign if they would like to come in. But I remember I have to be very strict on time management because we are limited by time. So we can now come to the fourth agenda point of today's meeting, COVID-19 pandemic and its social consequences, the long-term effects, and the important role, if I must say, of civil societies. And we all know that the coronavirus pandemic had a very, very profound impact on civil society, and this in a negative way, but also in a quite positive way. On the one hand, some governments use the crisis as an excuse to tighten control over civil society organizations, but on the other hand, the pandemic has raised the importance of civil society actors, who often had to move in to fill the gaps left by governments in their often chaotic policy responses to the crisis. And moreover, the pandemic pushed civil society actors to find new ways to work. Like many of us, this pandemic has boosted creativity, and also civil society has been very creative, which is, I think, very positive. So in this meeting with civil society, we will examine the nature of these coronavirus-related shifts in civil society, and this in Europe, but also in Latin America. And I will give now the floor. We have some guest speakers. We have a very interesting panel, I must say, and I would like to thank the Secretariat for organizing these excellent speakers. So I would give the floor now for 8 minutes, and our first speaker is from the European Economic and Social Committee, our good friend Joseph Pucheo, who is the president of the Latin America Follow-up Committee in the EESC. Josep, you have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman. It's a great honour and pleasure to speak here as the representative of the European Economic and Social Committee, and also to cooperate with EuroLat, which is doing such excellent work when it comes to putting the issues that affect both sides on the agenda. So thank you very much for this invitation. And I'd particularly like to say thank you to the new Vice President, Mr. Serrano, and all those of you who are participating in this forum. It's a shame we have to be online for it. It'd be great to be able to meet, enjoy your company, and discuss things at greater length, because there are many challenges to be dealt with. Since 1958, you'll be aware that the European Economic and Social Committee has been a forum for discussion by organised civil society, NGOs, the business world. We meet together and we issue our opinions, which we hope are of value to other organisations, including EuroLat. And we focus on the issues that are the most important. Currently, obviously, we're talking about COVID, and that's clearly ravaged and impoverished many regions of the world, but it's had a particular impact in Latin America. Tens of thousands have passed away in my country, but also in France, in Italy, and as you're aware, it is the Latin American continent which is now suffering the most. So I think the time has come to act, and what we would propose, subsequent to discussions that we've held in the European Economic and Social Committee's follow-up committee on Latin America, is as follows. Well, we have COVAX, but we know that that's proceeding very slowly. And as civil society and you as members of parliament need to draw attention to the fact that words are not enough. We have to act. We have to send out millions of doses of vaccines so that we can ensure that there are opportunities for people to be vaccinated. We haven't been massively successful in Europe. We certainly weren't until the second or third months of this year, but now I think we've reached cruising speed in terms of vaccinations, and I think it's now credible to say that we will be prepared for any new mutations that may emerge. So it really is essential to properly launch COVAX, but we also need to ensure that all forms of direct assistance and cooperation are working as well. We have clearly detected that aspects of the green transition, social inclusion and digitalization continue to be the levers that we need to work on most rapidly after the pandemic. We need to ensure that these cooperation mechanisms are working properly, because if we don't do that, we will be slowing down our and your emergence from this terrible crisis. Now, I represent the business sector in the EESC, but nevertheless, I would say that we need to reduce issues relating to public deficits. This is something that has given European Union member states oxygen during this difficult time. It's also helped the United States. The administration there, Joe Biden, has deferred debt deficit mechanisms, and this massive injection of funds has meant that the US will be able to rapidly emerge from this crisis situation. So I think all of that's important. We also believe that there are challenges that are specific to the region, such as the informal economy and the impact on SMEs, and those are things that have to be taken into account. In particular, when it comes to the informal economy, there have been closures, shutdowns, lockdowns, and the thing is that that has led to extreme poverty for people working in that sector. So these are challenges that were already there prior to COVID, but they need to be dealt with even more urgently now. And given the context, having discussed the ideas relating to cooperation and direct assistance, I think the modernization of trade agreements is important. We have one with Chile that's being upgraded. There's one that's one with Mexico that's being upgraded, but we need ones with other. Well, we already have them with other countries, but we need to push them forward. We need to boost those agreements, and we need to do that because we believe that economic, social, environmental and technological transfers are things that take place when we have good association agreements. We need rules that we don't have at the moment. We need to ensure, for example, transparency. They need to be explained properly, and there needs to be awareness raising carried out. The problem is, without all of that, both sides can feel frustrated and discriminated against. These agreements also have transition periods and areas for reciprocity, compensation for the most vulnerable where there are difficulties, and they also provide legal certainty. So I think that these agreements are important, and in particular the EU-Mercosur agreement that we've been working on for 20 years now is extremely important. To conclude, let me say that the role of civil society also needs to be improved. There needs to be dialogue with civil society, and that's something that we know how to do. We're good at dialogue. Civil society is used to talking. The association of advisory committees that already exist relating to some agreements are crucial, because it's relations between the parties to agreements that mean that agreements can be effective for societies. So, a critical situation, a very difficult situation at the moment. Difficult in terms of health, but also in terms of increasing poverty. We need to deal with that situation, and the options that we would suggest are, as I've mentioned, cooperation, agreements, and working on deficit funding mechanisms. So thank you very much, Co-Chair. I don't know how long that took, but I hope I was brief enough.
Cheo, it's very good that you underlined that the importance of the dialogue with civil society is so important, and especially in these three subjects you mentioned, to push to speed up COVAX, the direct forms of cooperation when it comes to the challenges of digitalization and combating climate change, and also the modernization of the trade agreements. Here also civil society have sometimes critics, but also sometimes positive input, and we have to really foster this dialogue with civil society. Thank you very much once again. Our second speaker is Mr. Federico Rossi, who is Professor of Political Science at the San Martin National University in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and also researcher of the National Council for Scientific and Technological Research, CONICET. Mr. Rossi, the floor is yours.
Agradezco la invitación a conversar.
Thank you for inviting me to talk about an urgent issue for Latin America. Before I begin looking at social movements and COVID-19, I just wanted to tell you a bit about the results of my research on social movements in general. So, you'll hear more about this from other speakers, from Rebecca Abers. But if we look at Latin America, it's worth comparing different countries. So I've got a PowerPoint presentation which is in 3 languages, which facilitates things. So if we move on to the next slide. Here we have to look at key trends so as to understand the region better. We see that at the moment there's a lot of uncertainty, changing events. The pandemic has led to greater political polarization. It's reinforced existing divides. That means the composition of the government and the opponents is the two are very far apart. And we also need to look at the national contexts, because this will influence the medium and long-term response to the pandemic. So there are 5 main threads that we've managed to reveal. So each country has tried to cope with the pandemic in its own way, Argentina and Brazil. If we move on to the next slide. So in Argentina, which I will look at more, and Rebecca Abers will talk more about Brazil, but in Argentina, social movements are often close to the government, and they often occupy places in government as legislators. Then at the same time you also have other social movements that are clearly closer to the opposition. So these divides have long existed, and the main responses of progressive social movements are to exert pressure on the government and they are trying to focus on short-term and medium-term responses. Whereas the conservative social movements have a different response. They prefer to focus on the trade and economic issues. They're more focused on the economy and movement of persons. If we just look at a few examples, negative and positive, we've recently seen a new tax imposed on the wealthiest in Argentina, which will only affect 0.07% of the population, those who owned more than 2.5 million euros in assets. And the aim of that tax is to buy vaccines, PPE, support for the most vulnerable children who are of schooling age, to provide support for SMEs, and to provide support for jobs, and to construct housing, and to organize further infrastructure development. So this plan, this tax, was already in the pipeline before the pandemic, but when the pandemic emerged, the need for the tax became much more acute, especially as there are many people in the country who are working in the informal economy. So the progressive side of society was really pushing for the introduction of this tax. Then there was also an idea that there needs to be a kind of Marshall Plan for Argentina, especially to help those in the informal sector. That would include large-scale building projects, boosting of employment, and lifting 3.5 million people out of poverty, particularly in and around Buenos Aires, which is where most of these pockets of poverty are to be found. And the aim is to fund that with this new tax and to coordinate that within the state. But what's interesting is that each of the two movements has its own different views on each subject, on the informal economy, on the territorial development, and on other issues. What we've also seen in civil society terms is that there are more and more food banks, more and more soup kitchens, and these are all part of a new wave of working class movements. So in addition, we have a lot of social movements, but also scientific communities. And what we also see is that there's a lot of social unity and a lot of social work in smaller and medium-sized factories and textile fabric factories and other factories. So there are many other examples of social movements which are important in the country. But to conclude, the situation in Argentina is worrying, just as it is in much of the rest of Latin America. But the activation of civil society, particularly working class civil society, has made it possible to come up with solutions, and they're also suggesting more longer term solutions for the post-COVID environment, and also solutions which go against the neoliberal grain. So I'm going to conclude there, and thank you for your attention. I'm open for questions if you have any.
Thank you very much, Professor Rossi, for sharing your results of your research on the social movements. It's very interesting that you highlighted this difference between the progressive social movements and the more conservative social movements. And it's good to hear at the end that the social movements have been very creative in finding solutions. So thank you very much. Now we come to our third speaker from Brazil. It's Ms. Rebecca Abers, who is a professor of political science at the University of Brasilia in Brazil. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here today. I would like to thank EuroLat for the invitation. And Federico already spoke about part of our research about a comparison about Argentina and Brazil, focusing more on Argentina. So I'm going to speak about the response of civil society to the pandemic in Brazil. Next slide, please. In order to understand what has been going on in Brazil, I will use 2 minutes of my time to give you a bit of context about what's going on in this country. In 2019, for the first time in Brazilian history, an extreme right-wing president, Jair Bolsonaro, took office just a year before the pandemic, and his government quickly worked to dismantle the strong structure of institutionalized civil society participation left by his predecessors, and he began to eliminate or even defund a broad array of social and environmental programs. At the same time, the government had the support of its own social movements. Over the course of 2019, there were regular street protests in favor of the president and against democratic institutions, such as the Supreme Court and the Congress, sometimes openly calling for military intervention. So when the pandemic arrived last year, Brazil was already facing increasing polarization and political crisis, not just in political institutions, but also in civil society. Next slide, please. The president's response to the pandemic has further polarized the country. His response has been denialist since the beginning, denying the pandemic's severity, defending the use of unproven treatments, questioning the use of masks. But these ideas, coming from the president, have had powerful influence in society. It also should be noted, however, that there are many other groups in Brazil producing and disseminating denialist discourse, especially through digital technologies. Authoritarian denialists also continue to mobilize on the streets. Just a few days ago, on May 1st, a wave of pro-government protests called for the right to work during the pandemic and explicitly called for military intervention against lockdown policies. As to actual policies, the response to the pandemic has lacked federal government coordination, leaving state and municipal governments to decide what to do. They have implemented lockdown measures to varying degrees and in many places very inconsistently. The most important government response to the pandemic was legislation passed by the opposition in Congress on the basis of a civil society proposal. This was the creation of an emergency income transfer program for the poor that eventually reached almost half of Brazilian households and temporarily reduced economic downturn. On the whole, however, Brazil's policy response has been inefficient, as shown by the various sources, by various sources, such as the Policy Adoption Index mentioned here of the University of Miami, that tracks the implementation of 9 policies intended to help control the pandemic in Latin American countries. Next slide, please. As you can see here, Brazil has rated close to the bottom over the course of the last year, only above Nicaragua for much of the period in terms of public policy to combat the pandemic. Next slide. So, what has civil society done in face of this situation? Since last year, my research group at the University of Brasilia, HESOC, has been cataloging civil society activity against the pandemic. You can access our repository at the site presented here. We show that in the Brazilian case, civil society has had to fight not only the pandemic itself, but also official denialism. So in the next few slides, I will briefly describe some of our findings. Next slide. Yes, that's right. Part of the civil society response, as in other countries, has been a massive upsurge in solidarity initiatives, largely focusing on the distribution of food and cleaning supplies. The map on the left, produced by one organization, shows about 1,400 such initiatives, but there are many, many more. These projects have been implemented by a vast array of organizations, small and large, in small towns, such as the one in the northeast of Brazil, shown in the upper photo, to the favelas of the cities such as Rio de Janeiro, shown in the bottom photo. Next slide. In addition to solidarity initiatives, civil society groups have been dedicated to combating denialism and, more generally, to providing and disseminating reliable information. One example is the vulnerability map produced by organizations in a city in the Northeast to try to support local government decisions in response to the pandemic. On the right, you can see the smartphone app created by the Voice of the Communities, a favela journalism organization in Rio de Janeiro that has sought to disseminate information about the virus, how to protect oneself from it, and where to get help. Next slide, please. Despite the restrictions on gatherings, civil society groups have also found creative ways to express dissatisfaction with the lack of effective government responses. Socially distanced street protests have occurred, such as the one in São Paulo shown here. Symbolic cemeteries and protests by healthcare workers have also been common, among many other forms of protest. Next slide. But civil society organizations have also sought to go beyond criticizing and denouncing by promoting policy solutions. One example is the Emergency Aid Program, which, as I mentioned earlier, was proposed by a coalition of civil society groups and originally proposed to Congress by opposition politicians. Many organizations have called for an extension of that program for the duration of the pandemic. Another much more recent initiative, which I have been involved in, is the creation of a network of more than 3,000 women scientists who hope to become a source of policy information and advice for subnational governments who have been basically left to their own devices in the absence of a strong national response. Going to the last slide, thank you. So to conclude, where is Brazil going? What are our challenges? In the absence of an effective national response, civil society initiatives have guaranteed the protection to millions of Brazilians, both through the thousands of solidarity initiatives I described, and also by pressuring Congress to implement emergency cash transfers and other policies. But denialist discourse has limited the nation's capacity to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. This includes civil society organizations. By forcing civil society and more responsible politicians to spend most of their energy denying denialism, Brazil has been unable to focus on the long-term responses to a crisis that will certainly have long-term consequences. In this context, emergency civil society coalitions that bridge health and inequality issues and fight disinformation need support from international allies, not just to promote the kinds of emergency responses that you have seen here, but also to develop and push for longer-term proposals for economic development, combating inequality, and for avoiding future pandemics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Ebers, for your presentation and also for the difficult situation you explained us, which exists for civil society in Brazil. It's clear if there is a lack of public policies that the role of civil society becomes even more important. And it was also interesting to hear you explaining us this double challenge you have. Not only does the civil society have to combat the pandemic, but also this denialism, and this is very difficult. I also would like to congratulate that you created the network of women scientists. Yesterday in the Women's Forum we discussed very long the importance of the role of women in combating COVID, and of course women were at the forefront during the whole last year, and they are also hit much harder by this pandemic. So thank you very much, Professor Ebers. And then we come to our next speaker, who is Rosa Llobregat from the network, and she's the Network and Policy Officer and representative of the EU-LAT Network. Ms. Llobregat, you have the floor.
Hola, buenas tardes. Buenos días.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank you for allowing me to participate in this forum. The EU-LAT is a network comprising 40 organizations focusing on human rights and solidarity between Latin American countries. I'm going to speak on behalf of our working group, which brings together various civil society groups working in Latin America and the Caribbean. Next slide, please. Next one. We're particularly concerned by the worsening of the democratic situation and the worsening of human rights. The virus is affecting all of us, but not in the same way. This pandemic has worsened economic, gender-based and ethnic inequalities. It's also highlighted the lack of high-quality public policies, the lack of health systems, and the lack of universal social protection. We need a new social contract, and we need to support the region in this transformation. Vaccines against COVID-19 are a crucial key if we are to end this crisis. But according to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, in 2021, 90% of people in low-income countries won't get the vaccine this year. So we're very concerned. As the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has said, vaccines should be a common global good in everyone's reach, equally without discrimination. And we move on to the next slide. My presentation focuses on three groups who are suffering in a disproportionate way because of the crisis: women, human rights defenders, and indigenous groups. Women are hit extremely hard in Latin America and in Europe by the pandemic due to gender-based violence. That means that at the moment they are far away from support services. There are high levels of femicide, and there's the scourge of sexual and physical violence. Luckily, we have the Spotlight program, which aims to give women greater access to resources. We're spending more time online, and there's now the new problem of cyberbullying and digital violence. So there's been a 38% increase in digital violence against women. We also know that 54% of women work informally without a contract. There therefore need to be measures that will make the informal economy less informal, with contracts, with proper coverage. So women are also overrepresented in the health sector. They make up 70% of workers in the healthcare sector in the US, and there's a salary gap of 25%. Women are also affected by non-remunerated care work. Women do 3 times more care work than men, and that's gone up during the pandemic. It went up 51% in Argentina during the crisis. The EU, through its support programs, needs to empower women and focus on the development of the social and solidarity economy. The EU also needs to show political leadership in the fight for gender equality, but also in ensuring that various international treaties on women's rights are upheld. Next slide. Now, the next group that is affected, we want to talk about the impact on indigenous people and rural communities. Although there is an effort to collect data, we lack official data. So that means we don't know the scope of this catastrophe, how this disaster is infecting them. We know that those in rural areas and those who are indigenous people are less likely to have access to sanitary and health infrastructure. In Peru, there's a lack of infrastructure. For instance, in Peru, only 40% of indigenous households have 40% of indigenous households don't have access to water, double of non-indigenous households. And only 10% of farming communities have access to clinics. There's too much focus on industrial mining, industrial agriculture, and industry in general. All of these are extremely risky sectors. At the moment, there is a lack of democratic accountability as well. That's why the EU needs to help the indigenous people to ensure that their rights are upheld so that they can fully access their rights. A lot of raw materials come from Latin America. So we need to look again at our trade ties, look again at the extractive industries, and look again at the way that we use commodities such as soya and palm oil, which have a major impact. So we want to encourage the European Parliament to focus on due diligence and negotiate a solid piece of legislation on due diligence so that those who are victims can fully access their rights. Now, I'd also like to stress the important role of human rights defenders. In Argentina, there has been an instrumentalization of the crisis to clamp down on people's rights. There's a shrinking civil space. There have been attacks on virtual spaces, and there have been attacks on human rights defenders. According to an Amnesty International report, Latin America is the most dangerous part of the world if you are a defender, an environmental defender or a human rights defender. Even online, there are more and more attacks, and there's a lot of focus on women defenders. That's why it's so important that we have measures that are differentiated in nature. That's why I want to stress that the EU should adopt an annex on gender, on whistleblowers and on human rights defenders. It's also important that the Escazú Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation and Justice be ratified. This is important in human rights terms, so the EU should encourage all governments who have not yet signed the Escazú Agreement to do so and to enforce it. Final slide. Here, once again, I just want to recognize the importance of this forum, and I have a couple of questions just to open up the debate. So, what model should be put forward? Will our model be one based on commercial and trade interests, or will it be one where human rights are at the center? And then also, another question is, how is the EU going to accomplish its ambitious plans? For instance, its human rights plan and its gender action plan. How is it going to do that, especially if there are less funds available? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa, for this very interesting presentation and for presenting the work of the EU-LAT Network and also of your civil society working group. The gender-based and ethnic inequalities, they have grown not only in Latin America but also during the crisis here in Europe. And many points you mentioned, we could draw parallels from both sides. So thank you very much. I think the European Parliament heard your call for due diligence. This is a subject we treated in one of our last plenaries and we debated it. And I personally agree with you on that. I would like to thank our four speakers, Mr. Pucheu, Mr. Rossi, Mr. Abers, and Ms. Llobregat for their very valuable contribution. And I think our co-chair, Mr. Serrano, would also like to come in. So before I open the floor to all our other colleagues who requested the floor, I of course pass the floor now to to José. The floor is yours.
Gracias, querido co-presidente.
Thank you, Co-Chair. I think the presentations from our guests have been succinct, but very comprehensive at the same time, and I think they've given us a snapshot of a complex reality from which we can emerge if we see it as a whole. I think that there are elements that we need to add to the information that we've been given. And I think the issue of violence is one of them, but also unemployment. The levels of unemployment in our region are quite simply unsustainable. 26 million jobs were lost during 2020 as a result of the pandemic. But as has been said by the speaker about Brazil, the situation with regard to rights and democracy have been undermined in Latin America. Military controls, confinements, curfews, and other things as well, I think certainly show a sustained weakening of fundamental rights. These rights are being undermined, and clearly power is being accumulated in some countries by certain actors, which is certainly something of concern. With regard to the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, I think certain adjustments will have to be made so that we can properly look at the goals that have been set by the UN. And I think that civil society will have a key role to play when it comes to redesigning these Sustainable Development Goals so that we can continue to count on this UN instrument to help develop our countries. Finally, Co-Chair, I think it's also important to emphasize that we need a different path. We need a paradigm change also when it comes to international relations. Corruption in Latin American countries has reached critical levels, I'd say, particularly when it comes to the purchase of medicines and all kinds of equipment that's necessary to fight the pandemic. Constitutional states based on the rule of law are only sustainable if civil society is free to express itself and also has the opportunity to make a direct contribution to governing bodies. And I think, given that, now is the time to boost civil society's participation in all governing bodies. They need to play their role as citizens, but they also need to be seen as a sector we can cooperate with, which has its views, so that we can foster security, education, food security, and many other areas as well. Thank you very much, Co-Chair.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair, to you, and also for recalling the important role of civil society as an ally of us politicians and of us people who are governing and legislating. So I have the list of speakers, and for those who haven't asked for speaking time in advance, please feel free to give us a sign, so I will add you to the list, because I think we are running more or less good in time. Is that so? Yes. So the first speaker would be my good friend. It's my good friend Inma Rodriguez Pinheiro from the S&D Group. Inma, you have the floor. Inma is not connected right now. Then we have Miss Isabel Benjumea from EPP from Spain. Isabel.
Muchísimas.
Thank you, Co-President. Thank you to all four speakers for their presentations. I think we all hope that the pandemic will soon come to an end. A few questions in relation to what was presented to us. One question is related to unemployment, which is obviously terrible if you face it. Unfortunately, the connection is extremely poor and it's difficult to interpret. As I say, unemployment affects millions of people. So I therefore want to ask you, the connection has been lost, unfortunately, confirming the poor connection.
Isabel, I don't know if you hear us, but the connection was really bad, so it was, first of all, quite difficult for our interpreters to follow you, and also we couldn't hear you very well, and now you're cut. We're trying to re-establish the connection, and meanwhile, I will give the floor to our colleague from Parla Sur, Alejandro Carlen. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Sí. La verdad que muchas gracias por permitirme.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be involved in this meeting. Civil society has a very important role to play at this time of humanitarian crisis. I think all the states of the world are going to have to rethink their health policy, and the need to involve civil society in monitoring, in complying with the rules, and essentially looking after our neighbours, each other, as the Pope said. So I think we have to ensure that civil society can get involved in all processes necessary so that we can ensure that we can tackle the virus. I mean, we're going to have to live with the virus for a long time now, I think. And, well, we're becoming aware that we're going to have to manufacture 200 million doses of vaccine per year. Even that's not going to be enough. And I think we'll have to boost that amount. This idea of waiving patent rights, accessibility, all those things have to be looked at. And I think civil society has an important role to play there. I sincerely hope that social organisations, but also other intermediary bodies, will be able to get involved and work together so that we don't simply have state policy dealing with this. We want to see an integrated policy with all those involved making their contribution so that we can deal with the pandemic and move forward as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, for your call that civil society has to be included in health policies. If you allow, I can just give you an example. I was very active for many years as a UN AIDS ambassador, and I see how community health work, how civil society can do so much in helping combating a pandemic that was the AIDS pandemic. Here we are in a more global pandemic, which is even worse. So you're totally right that civil society has to be integrated in these health policies. So we come back now to Isabel Benjumea. Sorry, Isabel, that there was a problem, but we try it again, and the floor is yours, Isabel.
I don't know what went wrong, and por el problema de conexión. Estaba centrando mi intervención y quería enfocarlo desde dos perspectivas. Por uno, habían visto cómo estaba afectando desde un punto de vista sociológico a la iniciativa privada, a la vocación de querer apostar por la región, de querer poner en marcha del colega que acaba de intervenir en relación.
The connection is too poor to interpret, I'm sorry.
Vacunación para poder el acceso al trabajo y si está habiendo movimientos sociales en ese. Una pregunta también en relación al debilitamiento que están sufriendo las instituciones democráticas en la región, en algunos países de la región, y en concreto pues en el florecimiento de los pobres. Entonces, en cuanto al rol de la sociedad civil, a mí creo que hay una parte que es muy delicada, el tema de corrupción, desde el punto de vista de separación de poderes y de poder dar esas garantías a los ciudadanos de que va a haber un control sobre los gobiernos, los movimientos sociales de la sociedad civil en hacer presión, porque, bueno, verdaderamente sí que se ha visto en otras partes del mundo que esa presión de la sociedad civil ha sido determinante en cambios. Pues, por lo tanto, en relación al desempleo, la iniciativa privada y, por otro lado, la pregunta en relación a cómo abordar el debilitamiento de las instituciones democráticas y el rol que está jugando la sociedad civil.
Dear Isabel, the connection was really, really bad, so our interpreters could not follow you. But maybe some of our excellent Spanish speakers in this round could understand. I understood that you put a question at the end, and maybe one of our panelists was able to understand. But the technical, it was a very bad connection. So sorry for that. Sorry for that. But, you know, we're used to this, and we know, Isabel, it's not your fault. Then I have also our colleague from ECR, Margarita de la Pisa, who wants to come in. And Margarita, you have the floor.
Yes. Buenas tardes.
Good evening. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the speakers for telling us a bit about the situation in Latin America and these very tough times for everyone. More than ever, we need to prioritize and ensure that people's basic needs are met. We need to ensure access to healthcare, medication, vaccines, oxygen. We need to ensure that there's employment, human rights. This is a real humanitarian crisis. But I'm also concerned that there is a lack of communication between the authorities and civil society, and between the authorities and those who most need help. There's a lot of harm done by corrupt governments who don't put people at the center of their programs. They are making the most of this situation to further immiserate people, make their lives worse. These are non-democratic practices which make it impossible for a recovery to take place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita, for pointing out the lack of communication in COVID times between governments and civil society. I don't see, I look at the Secretariat, are there any sorry, any other participants who wish to come in? No. So then I think it's time to our four panelists, if they want to come in and comment on one or the other, interventions of our colleagues from both sides. And I call, I know it was difficult to understand for some because of technical reasons, but I come back to Mr. Pucheu, maybe. Or,
Julia Perry.
We have one more, sorry, we have one more intervention. Who?
Julia Perry, Argentina.
Julia Perry. Julia Perry from Argentina is asking the floor. Julia, the floor is yours.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. Well, in truth, civil society is always very proactive right across the world. We see what's going on in countries with deep-ranging crises. The previous speaker, I think, brought up the issue of corruption and repression as well, which is taking place, for example, in Colombia. It's important to speak up about that. It's something we shouldn't lose sight of. But co-chair members, I wanted to talk about the Women's Forum of EuroLat. We met yesterday. There was a great deal of participation and a great deal of concern among members on both sides. The forum has a very close link with civil society. There's a lot of work that is constantly being done with civil society by that forum. So I would invite you to make your contribution via that forum. I would invite you to take part in that forum because it's the EuroLat Women's Forum, of course, but the participation of men, the participation of anyone is very, very welcome because you could perhaps have a different way of seeing things which could be very valuable when it comes to resolving problems. Civil society, as you have said, co-chair, was very much involved in fighting AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, and needs to be again when it comes to fighting COVID-19. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention the need for vaccines, and these vaccines need to be a public good, as has been said by our parliament and as has been said by the Mercosur parliament. I think it was over a year ago now. This is something that civil society wants and is calling for, and it's something that should happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia, also for bringing up and the subjects of corruption and repression, which is also a topic here in Europe, of course, not only in Latin America. And also thank you for recalling the link between the civil society forum here, the civil society, this committee, and the Women's Forum. And you invited me to participate. Next time I will participate, and I promise you I will even participate in Spanish. So we come now to our four panelists, if they would like to react to what our colleagues have said. And I asked Mr. Pucheu if he would like to come in and comment. Mr. Pucheu.
Sí.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you for moderating this at this late stage of the day. I agree with everything that's been said by all the speakers. A lot of what they've said is complementary. And of course, in COVID times, joblessness and unemployment has gone up. But I'm not sure we can even trust the data for Latin America because there's such a big informal economy over there, and we don't really know what's going on there. What's really serious are the poverty indicators in Latin America. Rosa has pointed to the most vulnerable parts of society who are most affected. So we really need to focus our efforts on them. Many of these people are victims of a social, economic, and health crisis all at once, and sometimes they're even hidden from the statistics. But I think we shouldn't just think of these people as statistics. That's too cold. They're actual people. Now, I want to focus on the position of civil society. There's got to be permanent dialogue between politicians and policymakers and civil society. That communication needs to constantly be kept open. And we have to look at what we can do as the EU to strengthen civil society. We've been wondering about what the European External Action Service can do. I see that the European Commission doesn't list Latin America as one of its top 3 priorities, but it should continue. The Commission could continue to see Latin America as one of its top priorities. I know Africa is important, the Mediterranean area is important, our neighborhood is important, but we really have to keep our attention on Latin America because it's really been affected by COVID. And we also have such strong ties with Latin America. And civil society in Latin America is really asking for our help in many areas. So, of course, civil society is asking for economic help. But we also need to look at the role of China and how China has been involved in Latin America's economy. China's approach to Latin America has really changed over the past 40 years. So we also need to look at democracy, human rights, our affinity. These are all shared values that our 2 continents share. So that's the view of the EESC. We're going to continue to exert pressure. And then one final thing. We in the ESC have been in contact with a similar organization in Argentina, and we're so glad that that organization continues to exist in Argentina. And there was a recent business summit in Latin America, which I was able to participate in. So I think there are so many platforms which we can use to be in contact with each other. Thank you very much for having organized this evening session, and we will continue to be listening online.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pucheo, and thank you also for the excellent cooperation between the European Economic and Social Committee with EuroLat. We appreciate that very much. Then I give the floor to Professor Rossi. Professor, the floor is yours.
Gracias. Bueno, respondiendo a algunas de las preguntas.
Thank you. Well, let me respond to some of the questions and make a few comments with regard to the interventions we've heard. Well, I think corruption and the way the pandemic's being run have been brought up several times. The case of Peru is one case of an absolutist government, and there was corruption when it came to procuring vaccines and administering them as well in that country. And this is something that is generalized. I mean, it's not exclusive to Latin America, but it's something that definitely exists here. And I think we have to see it in wider terms than corruption. I mean, corruption exists, it's terrible, it's endemic, but I think that corruption of, for example, political and economic elites reflects Latin American society, a society which is extremely unequal in economic terms and also in terms of access to different goods and services, such as health, for example. The problem, I don't think, is so much whether the state is weak or strong, as is so often said. I think it's necessary to have a strong state, but what's not necessary is an authoritarian state. I mean, we want strong states such as you have in Europe so that the pandemic can be managed properly, but we also want involvement of civil society. And I think that is something that can be produced if government and civil society work together. What does happen, however, is sometimes decisions are taken when government and civil society work together, which are necessary but are not popular, and that happens in Europe as well. Now, when it comes to a state being strong or less strong, I think that's not really the issue here. The point is the dominance of elites. That's the problem, because that then produces gaps, inequalities, and exclusion. So I think the point here is to try and split these issues. I mean, privileged access to vaccines, people travelling to the United States to get vaccinated, the illegal trade in vaccines, black market dealing in vaccines, and the lack of a robust health system right across the region. And I think all of this is linked to inherited problems which relate to the inequality of society. So I think the pandemic shows that we need to look again at our societies, look at how the state has been established in Latin America, I mean, particularly since the dictatorships and the neoliberal period. And I think what we need to be aware of is the importance, for example, that the capacity to respond to an epidemic in Europe is based on having robust and universal health systems and a strong state. Our tragedy is that we don't have that. We also need to be aware of the state's capacity to bring the powerful to work together for a common goal, even if they don't want to for whatever reason. This is something that happens in Europe but doesn't happen in Latin America. I think all too often what's happening during the pandemic is that some economic players have more power than the state, and so certain actions are therefore limited. For example, a wealth tax is an excellent measure that should be replicated right across the Latin American region and also in Europe. This leads to a more solidarity-based, redistributive and progressive system. Tax solidarity and social solidarity are important. Historically, they weren't voluntary. They were based on state coercion, because it's the state that can levy taxes and sanction those who don't pay them, but it leads to the building of more peaceful, more cohesive societies where there is more redistribution. So I think there's a problem which existed before the pandemic, and we're seeing it increased during the pandemic. Thank you.
And now we come to Rebecca Abers from Brazil. Rebecca.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to make some more comments. I think I'm just going to briefly react to the comments by various members of the meeting who refer to the importance of stronger connections between the state and civil society. As many of you know, Brazil was undergoing, after 1988, when the constitution, the current constitution was approved, a 30-year process of state building was underway that involved, for example, the construction of a universal health system that has been fundamental for the success of the response that has occurred to the pandemic, including the distribution of whatever vaccines are available, has been what has occurred because of the strength of the universal health system that doesn't have more than a few decades of existence. But alongside this process of state building, of building social policy, was the creation of a broad-based system of civil society participation in many different social policies, such as health, social assistance, children's issues, the creation of thousands and thousands of councils in which civil society and state people met at the national, state, and municipal levels. And one of the other aspects of the sharp transition that has occurred in the last few years in Brazil has been the active dismantlement of the system of collaborative decision-making between state and civil society. So this has had serious consequences during the pandemic. Imagine, I have thought many a time, if during the pandemic there were still a strong system in place of communication between state and civil society, given that civil society is on the ground, in the territories, in the peripheries of the country, knows how people are dealing and so what the problems that they are suffering. The possibility of communication between municipal, state, and the federal government and these systems has been sharply undermined by the process of dismantlement of these councils. They still exist in some municipalities, and for example, in one city in Sao Paulo called Araraquara, there is a significant system of civil society participation still in place, which has apparently been very important for organizing the process of distributing humanitarian aid during the pandemic. Another example of the importance of civil society for the state is that group that I mentioned in my talk, and this also relates to the discussion, the references by many of you to the importance of women, the Brazilian network of women scientists, which was created only about 3 weeks ago. It's a very new network. And one of the, and you can already find on the organization's website a number of technical documents. For example, one issue that this group has tried to draw attention to is the fact that during the pandemic in Brazil, there has been a huge effect of COVID-19 on pregnant and postpartum women. They die at a much higher rate when they get COVID, and they do so in Brazil more than anywhere else in the world. And so, but there's no policy, no national policy for this issue. The Brazilian network of women scientists is trying to promote policymaking and provide information to policymakers on this really fundamental issue that affects women and has been basically ignored by the government. So that's the kind of way that civil society can help governments deal with problems. But as Federico mentioned, civil society is also really important for combating corruption. Civil society participation in policymaking processes is a way to promote combating corruption, providing more transparency, requiring governments to communicate what they're doing and to discuss with people who they do not choose is an important way to guarantee transparency and to create more public knowledge about what government is doing. And unfortunately, this kind of space, which Brazil was known for its innovations in producing more participatory democratic institutions, are under attack today in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for your additional comments. And then we come to Rosa Llobregat. And if you allow, Rosa, before I give you the floor, you asked 2 questions. You asked what model of cooperation we want between Latin America and Europe. Should we have just the commercial and trade interest on one side and forget the human rights dimension and environmental dimension? If I answer to that question, as my personal answer, we have to marry both, because we all committed to the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. And there's the 3 dimensions. There's, of course, the economic dimension of the SDGs, which is very important. But the social dimension and the environmental dimension, they all go together, the 3. So I really hope that in this Parliament we will manage to really put these 3 issues together. And I said already before, I gave you already an answer on due diligence. And then you also asked, how is the European Union going to be to accomplish its ambitious plan on gender action. And here I must say the Commission President, Madame von der Leyen, really is advocating, and it's not a coincidence that this Commission has a Commissioner for Equality, and we are thriving towards a union of equality. And Commissioner Dalli has came out with a gender equality strategy, with an LGBTI equality strategy, with a disability strategy, with the anti-racism action plan, and also our High Representative in his policies, European external action, the gender dimension, I think is quite important. And this is just to give some answers to the two important questions you raised. So now you have the floor to comment on what other colleagues have said. Please.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your answers. I also want to thank everyone else for their interesting comments, as well as the MEPs and MPs. The fight against corruption and impunity was mentioned. In this context, it's important to have a democratic space which is safe, so that civil society organizations in Latin America, Argentina, can do their job and can exert democratic scrutiny. It's also very important that this forum call out what's happened with the kidnapping and the attacks on politicians, as Federica referred to. I think it's also important to stress that we're not all affected equally by this pandemic. We shouldn't have more flexible rules. We should have a closer look at the human, particularly the most vulnerable, so that nobody is left behind. It's important that that kind of message emerges from this interparliamentary assembly. Then the European Parliament has a key role to play as an international observer. The EP can help judges, can do electoral observation missions, and can visit prisons. In Nicaragua, Peru, and Honduras, there were elections this year. So there needs to be new creative ways of monitoring those processes, those electoral processes, as international observers. If you can't be there in person because of the health situation, because of pandemic, then we have to try to do that work using new technologies. This year, in Europe, there's a lot of legislation in the pipeline in order to protect the environmental protectors, including the work and the legislation on due diligence. We would like this forum to talk with Latin American counterparts about good practices and about other measures. We could also suggest that you draw up a resolution on due diligence, calling for a very ambitious due diligence piece of legislation so that there aren't more victims, and if there are victims, they have the right of redress. So we also do support your work on due diligence, and we are available to you for further work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I would like to thank Rosa, Rebecca, Federico, and Josep for their valuable contributions, and also all the colleagues from both sides who came in, and thank you for staying with us. So we come now to the next agenda point. It's any other business, and I believe there is no any other items to be discussed, or if there are, please raise your hand. I don't see any requests for speaking. And then we come to the last point of this meeting. It's the date and the place of the next meeting. I must tell you that the exact date and also the exact place of the next EuroLat meeting with civil society is not fixed yet, and it will